Welcome back to Room 303 and our talks with Walt. We now turn to the 23rd poem of the 24 of inscriptions. The poem is simply called To You. And we've said already the ways in which we're looking at how these last three poems are all spoken to some kind of a future audience. There's a certain kind of intimacy that kind of blows our minds in some ways as we pick up a collection of poems like this. Hey guys, I can't even begin to tell you how, even in 1882, when we have the deathbed edition and beyond it, that no poet really had done this kind of thing where he or she kind of reaches out and welcomes you in. The one poet that kind of comes to mind is Emily Dickinson, and as we've pointed out, I really think that learning how to read Leaves of Grass helps us to read the great poetry of Emily Dickinson. Now, our assumptions, just to remind, if especially you have found this lecture and you're unfamiliar with some of the work that we're doing with this Talks with Walt project, our assumption is that you hit learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, you found the Talks with Walt file, and you've been paying attention to our previous lectures. I mean, we are now at the end of the inscription section of the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. All of the preceding 22 poems in many ways points now to poems at 23 and 24 to finish here. We are the stories we tell and retell. We're the stories we accept and the stories that we do decide to reject. But we don't want to ever reject a story until we know the story, and that's obviously our assumption here. Also, our learning theory of connecting new information to old information in meaningful ways. The new is the new. The NEW is the KNEW. Our annotative approach is, of course, to ask three guiding questions. What does the text say, level 1? What does the text mean, level 2? How can I relate to it in some way at level 3? We assume as well a working familiarity with our big five as we call it. What does this text say about epistemology, what you can know, ontology, who you are, psychology, the study of the individual mind, sociology, the study of the collective minds, and then the question of theodicy. Why do bad things have to happen, and how can I learn to ask, why did this happen for me, instead of why did this happen to me? Finally, and significant for the study of this little brief poem is, we see Whitman from 5 perspectives: as person, as poet, as pedagogue or instructor, and that's important here for us, as politician, a lover of democracy, and finally as philosopher. Now, as we've done in all of our previous lectures, let's work with a bit of background information just to make sure that we know where we place this one. This one was the last of the messenger leaves of Leaves of Grass, 1860, and then the poem was transferred to inscriptions in 1881. Now, this one is one of those remarkable poems that is only really technically 2 lines long, although the way it's broken up is usually into 3 lines. Let's go ahead and enjoy the poem. To You. Stranger, if you passing meet me and desire to speak to me, why should you not speak to me? And why should I not speak to you? Now, let's begin with the title and obviously the opening line of Stranger. This is this informal voice, this intimate voice, and I want you to put that in your notes because we're going to look at this over and over again. We're going to see this again and again in Leaves of Grass. The way Whitman kind of has this amazing rhetorical ability to kind of reach out and say, hey, come here for a second, I got to tell you something. It, of course, takes us at 3A to Coleridge's Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, how that old man is able to play that game with that young man. That young man's like, leave me alone, I'm going to the party. But by the end, he doesn't want to go to the party. He just wants to go home. And he's going to wake up the next morning sadder and wiser. Why? Because he was able to listen to what the old man had to say. Whitman plays something very similar with that kind of intimate voice to say, hey, hey, hey. He begins with the word stranger. Now, in the next poem, it will be reader. In the previous poem, it was poets. Here, it's the unknown individual, stranger. But notice we're going to have this odd rhetorical set of 2 questions. Do you see this? Fundamentally, the poem is just 2 questions that are rhetorical in nature. Stranger, if you, notice the if, the fallible position epistemologically speaking, right? If you, passing, notice the absence of a comma here, right? There should be a comma here most likely, right? Stranger, comma, if you passing, meet me and desire to speak to me. The first use of 3 speaks, by the way. We call this collection of lectures for Leaves of Grass Talks with Walt. This is the poem that will explain why we call it Talks with Walt. In other words, he says, what if we pass and all of a sudden you desire or wish to speak to me? Why should you not speak to me? The second of, again, the three speaks. It's an interesting rhetorical question. I ask you and challenge you right now at level 1, write down what question he's asking. What is that question? Well, of course, it's the question, hey, if you're interested in talking to me, why wouldn't you want to pause and talk to me? That is an interesting rhetorical question. Because, of course, that takes us back to the tradition of Plato's Republic, Book 7, the cave allegory. Do you remember when the instructor comes down into the cave in the actual story to emancipate the young man, not the old man, who is, of course, chained up and looking at shadows on a wall, thinking they're real. Of course, the young person is not altogether sure that he wants to speak with the teacher. Has to be dragged kicking and screaming out of the cave and the darkness of the cave into the light of the sun. What an interesting word picture, and yet notice Whitman is playing a very similar kind of game. Why shouldn't you want to talk to me? Now, there's good answers as to, by the way, as to why by 1881. One of those answers is because a whole lot of people who I kind of think know what they're talking about say you're a dangerous person. Go back to our lectures on Republic 7 and the very fact that Socrates himself was considered dangerous. By the Apology, the Platonic text, the Apology, Socrates is very dangerous. Of course, he calls himself a gadfly, right? And then, of course, the follow-up question, and why should I not speak to you, right? In other words, communication, it's symbiotic. In other words, reading Leaves of Grass is talks with Walt. We talk back to him through the annotative approach. I hope this will make sense to you as we get into the actual poems of Leaves of Grass. We're only in inscriptions now, but it's a communication. I have argued for a long time that if you learn how to read Leaves of Grass, you'll learn how to read America and Americans. You'll learn how to think in communication. You'll learn how to commune in communication. In other words, he says it, don't allow strangeness and distance to keep us from communicating. And of course, we live in a time, as Whitman lived in a time, where the lack of communication led to problems with conflict resolution and ultimately horrifying sacrifices. My book and the war are one, he will say. The horrific Civil War, and of course all of the tragedies that would follow that. At 2A, of course, our openness and a willingness to risk is the essence of relationship. Don't be afraid to take a chance is the point here that he's making. Talk with me. I want to talk with you. Why shouldn't I want to talk with you, he says. I love it. Of course, the whole poem hinges on that first word, stranger, right? Here at 2B, we've already mentioned the intimate voice of Whitman. It's almost like a whisper at times, right? The value, obviously, of the rhetorical questions, we'll pay attention to that. The repetition of this word speak happening 3 times. At 3A, well, think about the Odyssey and the way that Odysseus is such an amazing speaker. Think about Dante's Divine Comedy and all of the speaking that goes on there. Whitman is falling into a really important kind of epic tradition. All of those epic speeches, I mean, go back and look at what we say in our guided lecture of Virgil's Aeneid and all of the important speeches that are there. We talked about the importance of speeches in the Beowulf epic, and on it goes. The Epic of Gilgamesh. This ability to communicate and to speak happens in so many of these great texts. I mean, think about, on the negative side, what young man Hamlet says in Act 1, Scene 2, at the conclusion of his first soliloquy, but break my heart, for I must hold my tongue. Or how about T.S. Eliot's love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, it is impossible to say just what I mean. That challenge of being able to communicate, the inability to sometimes say the things we long to say. Have you ever found yourself now at 3B? I know what I want to say, but I just can't quite say it. Reading Leaves of Grass will help to qualify that in such profound ways. Now, what's fascinating is that you'll jump into Song of Myself, passage 46, and he will say it as the teacher, as the pedagogue, not as the poet. As the pedagogue, he will say, I hear you asking me questions. I answer, I cannot answer. You must find out for yourself. So it's going to be interesting. We'll have conversations or talks with Walt where sometimes he will throw the issue or the question back on you as students. How about this one? Well, and I'll give you an example of how this works. What was a time that you spoke with a stranger and it was so incredible that you had the courage to do it, and then at the end, you were no longer strangers? What was a time when you were too afraid and you didn't talk, and now you kind of wonder all the rest of your life, I wonder what would have happened if I could have had that conversation. And then to wonder about yourself, as we said in our discussion of Conrad's Heart of Darkness and the whole issue of Marlowe as being such a great talker, such a great storyteller, or our study of Mark Twain, for example, who was a great lover of Leaves of Grass and Whitman's project. How about you? Are you a great talker? Are you a good communicator? And I wonder the degree to which talks with Walt will maybe help us all become less strangers, better talkers. I hope so. Come back for the last poem of inscriptions. Thank you.